In May 1945, the war in Europe was finally coming to an end, but the fighting in Southeast Asia was far from over. In Burma, the Japanese army was retreating after being defeated at the battles of Imphal and Kohima, where they'd unsuccessfully attempted to invade India. Operation Dracula was well underway, with the goal of retaking Rangoon before the monsoons hit in early May. On May the 2nd, to support the naval and ground forces as they approached Rangoon, RAF 355 Squadron was tasked with taking out gun emplacements protecting the city. It turned out to be the final operation for B-24 Liberator KH-210 because it was forced to ditch in the Bay of Bengal. Out of a crew of 12, the co-pilot, Flight Sergeant Mick Pullen, and Air Gunner Sergeant Eric Kitely were the only two survivors. There's some historical significance to the crash because among the 10 crew members who didn't make it was Wing Commander James Nicholson, who was the only pilot in RAF Fighter Command during the whole of World War II to be awarded the Victoria Cross, which is the highest military honour in the UK. In August 1940, during the Battle of Britain, he was in a dogfight when his Hurricane was hit several times by cannon shot, which caused the cockpit to burst into flames. Despite being badly burned, he continued to fight, shooting down a Messerschmitt 110 before bailing out. As he parachuted to Earth, he was shot again, this time by a Home Guardsman who thought he was an enemy pilot. He somehow survived the ordeal and was awarded the Victoria Cross on November the 15th, 1940. My father, who flew with him 4 years later in India, told me that he was a very modest character who appeared to be embarrassed by the award, saying that there were lots of other pilots who were more deserving than him. The artist Robert Taylor recreated the scene of the action with this limited edition print. Each one was signed by my father. I tried to understand what had prompted Eric to volunteer for the RAF when he did. So, the very day that Nicholson was receiving his medal, the people of the city of Coventry, which is 10 miles south of Eric's hometown of Nuneaton, were frantically searching for survivors following a devastating air raid. The Luftwaffe had launched Operation Moonlight Sonata on the night of November the 14th, where 500 bombers destroyed the city and its ancient cathedral, and the resulting firestorm took the lives of over 500 civilians, who were later buried in 2 mass graves. Nuneaton was also attacked during the Blitz, with the worst raid occurring on the night of May the 17th, 1941. Here 131 people were killed, 380 houses were destroyed, and thousands more were damaged. In the background of this photo you can see St. Nicholas Parish Church, which miraculously escaped being destroyed and is where I'd later attend services as a child. I used to walk home from school down this street, and like I imagine most of the customers in Franny Annie's cafe today, I'd got no idea how much damage this part of the town had suffered. On a more personal note, during one of the raids on the town, his girlfriend, later his wife and my mother, had a lucky escape when an incendiary bomb crashed through her bedroom ceiling, then through the floor, before it came to rest in the living room in front of the fireplace. Luckily, it didn't ignite and her father dropped it into a bucket of water and took it outside. It took several weeks before the gaping hole in the roof could be repaired, apparently. So, 3 weeks after the May 17th raid, Eric went to the recruiting centre in Coventry and signed up for the RAF Volunteer Reserve. Less than 6 weeks later, just before his 19th birthday, he was called up for, quote, the duration of the emergency, and I imagine that he'd got no idea that that would be 5 years. After he completed initial training in Blackpool, he served in various locations around the UK, before being sent in May of 1944 to gunnery school at RAF Bishop's Court in Northern Ireland, where he completed 21 training flights aboard Avro Ansons. He kept a lot of the notebooks and manuals from the course. There's diagrams depicting the cone of fire, and strafing recommendations, how to estimate the range of approaching aircraft using the gun sight, and the mechanics and hydraulics of the various gun turrets in use at that time. The sketch showing the course of pursuit of an attacking fighter is interesting because by the time Eric would encounter the Japanese, their pilots had learned that attacking from the rear exposed them to the air gunners' fire for way too much time, and so they generally attacked from the front instead. After graduating from the course, he sent a postcard telling his mother about his deployment overseas before he shipped out to Mumbai, or Bombay as it was called then, via the Suez Canal. According to his photo album, while he was there, he did some sightseeing along Marine Drive before taking the train from Victoria Terminus to RAF Kolar in southern India. Incidentally, both Marine Drive and the railway station are now UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Kolar was where the airmen familiarized themselves with the four-engined Liberator bombers, and also where they formed up into crews. This was a pretty informal procedure because they were left to pick and choose who they thought they'd be most compatible with. This photograph shows Sergeants Potter, Cameron, Bell, Kitely and Helsby just before their departure for RAF Salbani in West Bengal. Except for Sergeant Potter, these men would form the core of Eric's crew. After being teamed up with pilot Gerald D'Souza for more training flights, they flew to RAF Salbani, which is about 70 miles west of Calcutta, and prepared for operational flights in 355 Squadron. The record book shows them arriving on November the 3rd, 1944. By the time of their arrival, the Japanese army had already been heavily defeated at the battles of Kohima and Imphal, where they had unsuccessfully attempted to invade India. The British Indian 14th Army, commanded by General William Slim, was steadily advancing from the west and north of Burma in pursuit of the Japanese, who had gone to suffer over 50,000 casualties during the retreat, which at that time was the biggest defeat in their military history. Slim's goal was to recapture Rangoon before the start of the monsoon season the following May, and then cut the main Japanese supply route up the Irrawaddy River Valley. Photographs from Eric's album show that Salbani itself was very undeveloped at this time, and outbreaks of cholera, typhoid and dysentery, plus a host of other diseases, were fairly common. The artist Frank Wootton spent time in Salbani, and his paintings reflect the conditions that the crews had to work in. The base was served by RAF 355 and 356 squadrons, plus others from time to time. 355 libs were identified by vertical white stripes on the tail, while 356 aircraft had a large white cross. The crews came from the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and in Gerald D'Souza's case, India. They flew missions to disrupt the Japanese lines of supply by bombing bridges, railways and supply dumps, and also tactical missions to support the 14th Army. By this point, the Allies had gained air superiority, but enemy flak and accidents took a large toll on the squadron. Of the 95 Liberators flown by 355 Squadron, 27 would be lost. The crews regularly undertook dinghy training for the eventuality of a ditching. I found a poster with some very optimistic instructions. It was well known by this time that the B-24 would usually break its back on impact and sink almost immediately, resulting in very few survivors. Although it has to be said that a crash landing in the jungle was a much better, because even if you survived the impact, wounds would very likely become infected and you'd face starvation or capture. The crews were well aware of the atrocities that the POWs suffered under the Japanese, and I was told that some of them carried cyanide pills hidden in a button to be used as a last resort. They were given jungle survival classes and taught some key phrases in Burmese, plus they carried some Japanese occupation currency to pay off the locals as needed. I used period correct maps and place names to be consistent with the logbook. And so, for example, Thailand is called Siam and Myanmar is referred to as Burma. And also, I apologise in advance for any mispronunciation of the place names. Here's some Australian War Memorial film showing my father's crew, with pilot Gerald D'Souza on the left and co-pilot Mick Pullen on the right. And here's a photo of the ground crew. Apparently strict adherence to military uniform wasn't enforced at Salbani. No doubt the awful climate was a big factor. His first mission, which must have been quite the introduction to combat operations, took 12.5 hours to complete and was an attack on the railway repair shops at Pitsunaluk in Siam. From his logbook, noting 150-foot height, and the photos, it appears that they made a strafing attack as well. Then, 3 days later, the railway yards at the southern end of the Sitang River was the target. This time they were accompanied by P-47 Thunderbolts, which drove off 2 attacking Nakajima Hayabusa fighter aircraft, which were known as Oscars to the Allies. The rail yards had been attacked earlier that day by US aircraft. In December, he flew 2 operations targeting railways and major ammunition dumps in Tongup, in support of the effort to drive the Japanese from the Arakan region of western Burma. He spent Christmas Day 1944 relaxing with his crew. Mick Pullen looks like he's enjoying a beer here, lying on his bed, or charpoy as they called it. And here's wireless operators Don Nicholson and Snowy Plowman. Due to the difficulty of maintaining concentration on the very long missions, each B-24 flew with 2 wireless operators who took turns at the radio. Starting in January 1945, Eric made notes in a pocket diary. The entries are very brief, but they do provide some insight into the daily life in West Bengal. One thing that struck me was how important his family was. In the first 8 months of the year, he received over 200 letters, plus newspapers and magazines. The crew started the new year with a week's leave in Lucknow. Here's some photographs from Eric's album showing him and Larry Helsby and Bob Bell, and also some shots of the beautiful architecture in Lucknow. I found these posters for the films he saw in Lucknow, according to his diary. Here's Going My Way, 4 Jills in a Jeep, and Jack London. And then on the way back to base in Calcutta, he saw Kismet. While he was in Lucknow, he met some gentlemen from the Long Range Penetration Force, known as the Chindits, which is an anglicized version of the word Chindhe, the lion statues that guard the temples in Burma. The Chindits were the forerunners of the US Army's Merrill's Marauders. They operated for months at a time well behind enemy lines, with the aim of sabotaging supply lines and attacking Japanese support troops. They were supported by USA Dakotas, which would airdrop supplies to them in the jungle. They were instrumental in the defeat of the Japanese at Imphal and Kohima, and their efforts provided plenty of ammunition for morale-boosting propaganda. But it came at a terrible cost, given their 30% fatality rate. Anyway, after Eric returned to base, he flew missions to Zayat Quin, Amarapura, Kyongong, and Kyoks. RAF Thunderbolts and US P-38 Lightning fighters accompanied them on the attack on the airstrip at Zayat Quin. Given the airstrip's strategic importance in protecting Rangoon, their crews were surprised to see such meagre opposition, and this was taken as evidence of an eroding Japanese capability. The airfield at Kyongong and then installations in Amarapura on the outskirts of Mandalay were next. I also have a copy of Mick Pullen's diary. His entry for the Amarapura raid makes for scary reading and illustrates the risks that the crews faced each time they flew over Japanese defended territory. It reads, "I had a very lucky escape, as a piece of flak shrapnel will show, which I've kept as a souvenir. Ran into the most concentrated and accurate flak barrage yet, and collected 3 holes. The one 9 inches in front of my nose, making me most uncomfortable. Still, we got back okay." Eric's diary also records the event, noting that the shrapnel hit Gerald de Souza's leg, but apparently without serious injury. And then at the end of January, in cooperation with US forces, the target was the Japanese rear headquarters at Kyoks near Mandalay. The newspaper article reported that 300 tons of bombs had been dropped. He kept many of the reconnaissance photos taken just after the bomb runs, and here's the one from the mission to Kyoks. Each one records the squadron reference, the date and time of the raid, the altitude, the bomb load, the direction of approach, the camera aperture, the aircraft ID, the captain, and finally the target. So here are the rest of the films that he saw in January, presumably at the base's cinema, which was really just a sheet hung over a rope. Anyway, here's Christmas Holiday, This Life, Get Cracking, Fanny by Gaslight, and Dr. Wassel. As the weather improved, the 14th Army, led by General Slim, was making good progress on the ground. Slim's strategy was to convince the Japanese that Mandalay was the prime target, but in reality the plan was to take Mictala in the south to cut off the main supply line. Possibly to reinforce this deception, in addition to Rangoon, Eric flew several missions targeting Japanese positions north of Mictala. So in chronological order, they attacked Madaya, Singu, Rangoon, Kietsha, Yinangyong, Mietha, Kongmudan, and Tongyi. Here's the recon photos from the raids on Madaya and Singu. The largest air attack of the Burma campaign to date occurred on February the 11th and was a raid on Rangoon. B-29s from the 20th Bomber Command and US AAF and RAF B-24 Liberators drenched an area north of the city. Huge fires erupted on the ground with smoke rising over 8,000 feet. Eric's formation was attacked by several Japanese fighters. 2 of them were destroyed, and Eric claimed a probable. As his diary states, "What an op today." In Kietsha, Japanese admin offices were hit, and then troop concentrations at Yinangyong, which was a major source of oil for the Japanese. He noted in his diary that his plane was again hit by flak. Yinangyong was a vital source of oil and had been fought over by both sides in the course of the war. Then, as part of another combined US and RAF operation, troop concentrations at Mietha were targeted. This time, in addition to the bombs, several thousand propaganda leaflets were dropped. The RAF referred to these as nickels, named after Operation Nickel, when in early September 1939 the RAF had dropped over 5 million leaflets to try and convince the German population that bombing each other's cities wouldn't be a good idea and they should abandon the war. Didn't work, apparently. Anyway, each nickel had a reference number. KH-210 dropped SBN-18, SJG-7, SJ-68 and SB-49 over Meatha. Eric had kept several of these leaflets. The sophistication of the leaflets had greatly improved as the war progressed. The goal was to convince the Japanese that they were being lied to by their leaders and were fighting a losing battle, but they would be fed and treated fairly if they surrendered. Also, the local Burmese population were encouraged not to support the Japanese because they'd soon be defeated. The raid on Kungmadon was interesting. In response to the advancing 14th Army, which was less than a mile away, the Japanese had dug in around an ancient pagoda. There's a newspaper article about this mission, claiming that following a request from the religious leaders, the crews had skillfully avoided hitting the shrine, a demonstration of precision bombing. Eric's diary simply says, "Hit large pagoda." Well, it's still standing, so I did a bit more research. In fact, 3 bombs hit the foundation walls, but the building didn't collapse. The opportunity for propaganda was too good to pass over, and the authorities printed the story in the local Calcutta paper, which was read later with some amusement in the squadron mess. His 8th and final mission in February targeted stores and troops in Torngi. So in between raids, he managed to see a couple of films, Betty Grable in Pin-Up Girl and Abbott and Costello's In Society. On the ground in the first 4 days of March 1945, Mictala was taken by General Slim. Eric had 4 missions in March, 2 to Rangoon and 2 to Bangkok. The first night raid to Bangkok took over 13 hours to complete, again targeting the railway workshops. Rangoon was hit on the 9th of March. 22 liberators from 355 and 356 were accompanied this time by 40 United States Air Force, or USAAF I should say, Mustang fighters, and then Rangoon again on the 17th. The final mission for Eric in March was Bangkok and took 13 hours and 35 minutes. His diary reads, "Boy was I tired." Elsewhere in an important development, on March the 28th, members of the Burmese National Army rose up and killed their Japanese officers to throw their support behind the Allies. And then on the 29th of March, Mandalay was taken by Slim's army. Churchill reportedly commented, "Finally, a name we can pronounce." Meanwhile, here are some of the films that he saw: Princess and the Pirate, 2 Girls and a Sailor, and 2,000 Women. At this point, he'd completed 20 missions, and the crew was granted R&R in Nainital in the Himalayan foothills. The temperate climate there must have come as a welcome relief from the incredible heat and humidity in Salbani. His photo album shows the winding roads leading to the lake and the crew relaxing. Here's a picture of some of them boating on the lake. It's sad to say that in less than a month's time, with the exception of Warrant Officer Ferguson, all these men would be involved in the ditching, and only 2 of them would survive. Anyway, while he was on leave, he got to see several films. He saw The Invisible Man's Revenge, Destination Tokyo, Her Cardboard Lover, and A Guy Named Joe, then Gaslight and Song of the Open Road. Gaslight's a really good film, and he saw it a couple of times. Incidentally, this is where the term gaslighting comes from. While they were in Nainital, he learned that a tour of duty was now going to require 400 operational hours, up from 300, which I assume wasn't received with a lot of enthusiasm. He arrived back at Salbani on the 20th of April and prepared for more operations targeting Rangoon again in support of Operation Dracula. The rush was now on to recapture Rangoon before the monsoon broke. The May the 1st mission was relatively uneventful, and KH-210 returned to Salbani around 6 o'clock in the evening. The ground crew quickly prepared the aircraft for departure in the very early hours of the following morning, leaving little time for the aircrew to recover from the previous sortie. Most of them had already met their required operational quota at this time, but despite being fatigued, they had volunteered for the operation. None of the crews would have been aware that while this was going on, the big news breaking in Europe that day was that Hitler was dead, having committed suicide in Berlin on April the 30th. So here's the crew list for KH-210, call sign R for Robert. Squadron leader Gerald D'Souza was the captain and first pilot. He was the son of a wealthy Indian family and one of the very few Indian nationals to have command of a bomber during the war. And Wing Commander James Nicholson, VC, who joined the flight to help with his studies into flying procedures during the monsoon season. He was married and had a young son. There's some contradictory theories about whether his presence had actually been approved, with one report suggesting that he took the place of the artist Frank Wootton. And Flight Sergeant Mick Pullen from Melbourne, Australia, he was the co-pilot. He'd been a professional Aussie Rules football player. Mick was married. Then Warrant Officer Jack Spillard from Kent in England. He was the navigator and also married. And Flight Sergeant Don Nicholson was the first wireless operator from Campbelltown, Tasmania, where he'd worked on his father's farm before enlisting. And then Flight Sergeant Samuel Doherty from the Toronto area was the second wireless operator and was married with 2 children. He'd replaced the normal wireless operator, Snowy Plowman, who was recovering from a serious skin infection at the time. Flight Sergeant Don Cameron from Scotland was the flight engineer. Flying Officer Brian Hill from Cardiff, South Wales, was the bomb aimer and also an air gunner. Flying Officer John Callan from Lancashire was the mid-upper air gunner. Sergeant Robert Bell, or Bob Bell, from Glasgow was assigned to the ball gunner position. Sergeant Lawrence Helsby, or Larry Helsby, from Liverpool was the rear gunner. And finally, my father, Sergeant Eric Kitely, who was the nose gunner. The squadron left Salbani just before 1 a.m. on May the 2nd and formed up to head towards the outskirts of Rangoon, where the gun emplacements defending the city were located. This is the route that they took. Anyway, I found some very grainy footage recorded during the actual raid, showing 355 Squadron Liberators approaching the target. And some landing craft offshore. And then the bombs being released. With some impressive shock waves from the explosions. And some smoke rising from the target, and finally more landing craft. However, for the crew of KH-210 it would be a very different and tragic story. The operations record book details the result of the raid. It reads, "Of 8 aircraft dispatched, 5 aircraft attacked the target. All sticks, with the exception of 2, fell in the target area, markers well straddled. 1 stick fell along the edge of the water to the southeast of the target and 1 stick undershot. The target was attacked in fair visibility. And then the statement, aircraft R is missing, ditched approximately 20.52 north, 89.33 east at 0250 hours. Based on statements made later during the court of inquiry, I pieced together what had happened. About 2 hours into the flight engineer Don Cameron reported that the outer port engine was on fire. Shortly afterwards, Wing Commander Nicholson, who'd been piloting the plane, gave his seat back to the co-pilot Mick Pullen. Don Nicholson sent a radio message saying that they were turning back to base. They were about 130 miles southeast of Calcutta over the Bay of Bengal, which would mean an estimated arrival time in Salbani around 6 or 6:30. However, the aircraft became very difficult to handle and it needed the full strength of both pilots to maintain control. They had to throttle back on the remaining 3 engines to prevent it from rolling. Despite discarding the bomb load and everything else they could overboard, it became impossible to maintain altitude, and Captain D'Souza reported that, quote, another engine is going. He ordered the crew to prepare for ditching. Bob Bell, Don Cameron, Larry Helsby, and Eric took up positions against the bull turret step, bracing themselves against the bulkhead. The aircraft rolled again, and without warning, the starboard wing hit the water. The plane broke apart on impact, and most of the wreckage sank within a matter of seconds. Eric was thrown into the water, and as he came to his senses, he tried to inflate his Mae West jacket, but it had been ripped open by the impact. There was a lot of debris floating in the water, and he wasn't a strong swimmer, but luckily the nose wheel had broken free during the impact, and it was floating close by. Despite having a badly injured wrist, he managed to tie the tapes of his jacket to the spokes of the wheel. He saw flames about 50 yards away, which he assumed was debris from the burning aircraft. In the darkness, he heard shouts from Larry Helsby, the rear gunner, who was calling out to Don Cameron to come and join him. Don had located the box of emergency supplies. Mick Pullen, who'd been catapulted through the front of the aircraft, was also in the water, clinging to one of the oxygen tanks. In the darkness, Eric shouted to Mick to join him at the nose wheel, but he swam away. As dawn broke, the 2 men drifted apart, and neither of them knew if anyone else had survived. Eric was suffering from multiple cuts and splashed the water to frighten off approaching sharks. Later in the morning, he saw his squadron overhead returning to Salbani. He was unaware that a search and rescue effort had been launched after KH-210 had failed to return to base as expected. A Liberator from 292 Squadron was joined about an hour later by 3 Catalina flying boats and a B-17 from the US 7th Emergency Rescue Service. The search continued all day until around 5:30 in the afternoon. One of the Catalinas sent a signal saying that they were landing at position 2120 north, 8904 east. No reason was given, but it later transpired that 2 Catalinas had separately picked up survivors. This location was approximately 45 miles from the coordinates given in Don Nicholson's radio message, and probably explains why it had taken so long to find them. Eric recalled that as the Catalina approached, the wingtip float forced the nose wheel under the water, with him still tied to it. After what he later described as an eternity, a crewman cut the straps and hauled him out. After spending what must have been a very lonely and frightening 16 hours in the water, he'd finally been rescued. The search for other survivors continued for several days, involving 11 aircraft from various squadrons. The body of Samuel Doherty was later recovered from the water, but despite the extensive search, none of the other crew members were found. Eric was flown to Alipore and then taken to hospital in Calcutta. Mick Pullen was picked up by a second Catalina and was suffering from shock. After being taken to hospital in Akyab, he was transferred to the same hospital as Eric and put into the next bed. He needs stitches in his chin and was treated for burns and given penicillin, which had only recently become widely available. He told Eric that he must have been hallucinating when he swam away from the nose wheel because he thought he'd seen Indians in a canoe trying to capture him. Eric had injuries to his hands, feet, legs, neck and back. He gradually accepted the reality that he and Mick Pullen were the only survivors. His diary note reads, "Very lucky to be here." The next day, while they were receiving medical treatment, the monsoon broke and the Allies reoccupied Rangoon without a fight. The Japanese had left the city, apparently leaving many POWs locked up in jail without any food. Here's a famous photograph of the roof of the jail, encouraging the Allies to hurry up. The squadron began dropping supplies to the starving inmates. On May the 7th, his fiancée and his mother received telegrams. I've got remnants from both of them, and together I've got a complete copy. They read, "We regret to inform you that your fiancé, or son, Eric Leslie Kitely, has been seriously injured during air operations and has been admitted to number 21 British General Hospital." His mother collapsed at reading it. Two close neighbours had already lost their sons. While most of the country was celebrating the end of the war with Germany, his mother and his fiancée were left to wonder what seriously injured meant. I found a copy of the original draft of the telegram, which was sent to Mick Pullen's family in Melbourne, Australia, where his mother was similarly upset. It took several days before the true extent of their injuries reached home. Telegrams were also sent to the relatives of the other crew members, at first saying that the airman was missing, but then confirmed dead. Here's a clipping from the local Nuneaton newspaper, and also his diary entry for the 23rd of May, where he noted the unfortunate wording of the telegram that had been sent home. His diary entry for May the 8th notes the reaction to the news that Germany had surrendered. I imagine the muted response was in part due to the fact that in the minds of the troops in Southeast Asia, their war was still far from over. So while he was recovering, he saw several films, including The Fighting Sullivans, which is kind of like an early version of Saving Private Ryan, and then Conspirators and Frenchman's Creek. After about 4 weeks in hospital, he was sent to a rehab facility in Kamak Street in Calcutta, before he returned to the base on June the 14th, where he arrived at 1:30 in the morning and apparently found someone sleeping in his bed. There were 20 letters waiting for him from home. He was granted 3 weeks' leave to aid with the recovery, and after a few days in camp, he left to go to Calcutta and then Darjeeling for some R&R. He noted the films that he saw in June: Bathing Beauty, Laura, For Whom the Bell Tolls, The Suspect, The Mummy's Ghost, Law of the Tropics, Wing and a Prayer, and Hollywood Canteen. So while he was watching Hollywood Canteen in Darjeeling, 355 Squadron along with 356 and 159 Squadrons attacked two bridges at Kanchanaburi, or Canberry as it's sometimes called. The bridges were a link in the infamous Death Railway, designed by the Japanese to connect Bangkok and Rangoon so as to avoid the long and vulnerable sea route around the Malay Peninsula. Over 12,000 POWs and as many as 100,000 native labourers died during its construction. There had been multiple attempts to hit the bridges, but each time they were partially destroyed, the POWs were forced to rebuild them. However, the June 24th attack was finally successful and put the rail link out of service for the rest of the war. The bridges were the inspiration for the film The Bridge on the River Kwai, which was loved by the critics but hated by the POWs and their relatives. Meanwhile, back in Darjeeling, Eric and his friends went horse riding, hiking, and saw more films. He returned to Calcutta on the 12th before returning to base where 28 letters were waiting for him. And on the 14th he saw the medical officer, was found fit, and learned that he'd been recommended to return to Blighty, the UK. However, a couple of days later he accepted an offer to go hiking in Kashmir, and before leaving he saw Gaslight again and the Yellow Canary. The crew took 4 days to reach Srinagar in the Sindh River Valley in Kashmir, and he and his friends spent several days at the Lakeview Hotel and apparently enjoyed swimming, yachting, and relaxing. Starting from Srinagar, they went to Kangen, Gunt, Sonamarg, the Thajiwas Valley and the Thajiwas Peaks, and finally Baltal, before retracing their steps back to Srinagar. According to the note in his diary, he completed 187 miles over the 4-week period. I found several photos in his album showing the impressive scenery. This is Gund and the camp at Sonamarg, and a couple of shots of the Thajiwas Valley and the Thajiwas Peaks. And here's a shot of the Needle Nye Valley, and then his comrades, and then 2 pictures of Glacier or Glacier 2. And finally, Eric taking a well-earned bath after his hike in Kangen. So while they were enjoying the scenery from the glacier on the 6th of August, they were blissfully unaware of what was going on in Japan, because the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and then 3 days later the second one on Nagasaki. It wasn't until a week later, on Wednesday the 15th of August, somewhere in the Sindh River Valley around Sonamarg, that they met a hermit who told them about the bombing and the Japanese surrender. He records having a celebration around the campfire until 2 a.m. with the rest of his friends, and the next day he apparently had a terrible hangover. And somewhat appropriately, this is where his diary entries stopped. But it does appear that he thoroughly appreciated his time in Kashmir, as he tried to put the recent tragedy behind him. A court of inquiry was set up to investigate the ditching incident and to try and understand why the aircraft had become so unstable. It should have been possible to fly the Liberator with 1 or even 2 engines out. An initial conclusion of the inquiry suggested that after engine number 1 had been feathered, the pilots hadn't selected the backup vacuum pump on engine number 2 to maintain power to the artificial horizon. However, Mick Pullen's statement to the Board of Inquiry specifically refutes this, as did a strongly worded letter from the Allied Air Commander in Southeast Asia, based on Gerald D'Souza's experience. D'Souza had reported prior to the ditching that he thought another engine was going. Eric told me that he believed that flak damage from a previous mission led to the initial fire, which then spread to the second engine. The Court of Inquiry finally concluded that, due to the lack of any hard evidence, the cause of the ditching was, quote, obscure, but linked to the engine fire, and no blame was assigned to the pilots. In October, Mick Pullen nominated Eric for membership of the Goldfish Club, which is exclusively for airmen rescued at sea. In a wonderful example of understatement, the conclusion of the letter reads, "May I offer my congratulations on your escape, and I hope that you are none of the worse for the experience." At the time, PTSD wasn't acknowledged. On the back of the card, there's some very interesting artwork, which seems so out of character with the documentation in use by the RAF at the time. After spending Christmas 1945 with 355 Squadron in Salbani, he was released from active service on the 20th of April 1946, having been promoted to warrant officer. And then on Boxing Day, December the 26th, he married his fiancée and settled down to civilian life. He kept in contact with Mick Pullen in Australia until Mick's untimely passing in 1969 at the age of 48 following a heart attack playing golf. With the exception of Sam Docherty, who's buried at the Bhawanipur Cemetery in Calcutta, the crew's names, along with 24,000 others whose remains were never recovered, are engraved on the walls of the Kranji War Memorial in Singapore. On a layover in Singapore, I'd visited Kranji, and from the photographs I took, and with the aid of a magnifying glass, Eric found the names of each one of his crew. I still have the photographs and they're faded, but still just about legible. For me, the really sobering takeaway are the ages of the crew. Larry Helsby and Bob Bell were both 21. John Calland was the eldest at 36. Brian Hill was 28. Don Cameron was the youngest at 20. Jack Spillard was 34. Don Nicholson was 25. Gerald D'Souza was 31. And James Nicholson was 29. I discovered a plaque at the US Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, commemorating the 1st and 7th Emergency Rescue Squadrons. The 1st ERS was active in the Mediterranean, and the 7th in the China, Burma, India theatre. Between them, these two squadrons were credited with saving the lives of over 400 airmen. Obviously, my father and Mick Pullen are in that 400. So, what happened to the B-24s after the war? Under the terms of the Lend-Lease program, the aircraft in India were deliberately rendered unusable, typically by putting sand in the engines or running them up without oil or other such methods. About 100 planes were left on an airfield graveyard at Kanpur in India. After independence, the Hindustani Aircraft Company cannibalized these and restored about 40 of them, which were then put into service by the Indian Air Force, and some of them remained in service until 1968. Many years later, the Collins Foundation of the USA purchased one of these aircraft from a collector in the UK and later renamed it Witchcraft, which was going to be used in flying displays. Interestingly, prior to its use in the Indian Air Force, this aircraft was identified as KH-191 and had been delivered in October 1944 to RAF Squadron No. 8, based in Jessore, India. Coincidentally, this was about the same time that Eric arrived in Salbani. Some time ago, Witchcraft came to Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. I hadn't planned to take the flight, but there was a seat available and I used my iPhone to record the experience as best I could. The noise was just incredible, which probably explains why so many of the crews, including Eric, had hearing problems later in life. However, it gave me a brief taste of the conditions that the crews endured on what were some of the longest missions of the war. This is the mechanism for lowering the ball turret. I can't imagine how uncomfortable, not to say frightening, it must have been for Bob Bell to spend any time inside this tiny space. These are the supply tubes for the rear gunner's ammunition, which had to be stored further forward to maintain the appropriate centre of gravity. I noticed that there was a bend in the top tube, but then I found some archive footage of a B-24 showing someone, probably the rear gunner, using the tube as a makeshift couch. The side of the fuselage has names of the various volunteers and patrons for witchcraft. I noticed that someone from RAF 356 Squadron is mentioned, Peter Compton. Here's some film taken in Salbani. This is the local egg store with a couple of gentlemen enjoying cigarettes next to the straw roof, which could have been interesting, I guess. And then some local transportation and the local laundry. And then the maintenance area with the 355 Squadron Liberator. And then this is flight control. I'm not quite sure what PWLF stands for. And then this is someone claiming a fighter. And then we have a briefing of 356 Squadron for a raid on Rangoon. And a note telling the crews not to forget their kukri knives and also to leave all their personal stuff back at the base. This is an auxiliary fuel tank being installed for one of the longer missions. Not exactly high tech, but it must have been very hard work in the heat and humidity in Salbani. And they are lifting it into the forward bomb bay. Here are some bombs being transported to the aircraft and loaded. This looks like it might be a bit hazardous. This is a 355 Squadron Liberator taking off. It wasn't unknown for a heavily loaded aircraft to stall and sink back to Earth. I'm not sure what location this was, but there's huge fires and smoke rising from the target. And here's a good shot of a 356 Liberator in flight. Here's one of the targeted bridges. It looks like it's been rebuilt by the look of the supports in the foreground. I think the flashes are from the gunners strafing the train below. Here you can see a span of the main bridge that's been destroyed, but a bypass has been built a short distance away. Here's a 355 Liberator. So sports were encouraged, and there's a video here of a soccer game being played on a pretty rudimentary pitch. I've looked at this video multiple times to see if I could recognise Eric, but without success. He may not have been playing in this game. He noted in his diary that he'd tried to play in one of the games, but his injured foot proved to be too painful. And this final shot is of Mick Pullen attempting to save a penalty. This is a shot of Salbani taken in February 1944 with some liberators being prepped for an operation, and in contrast this is Salbani today. It's now being used by the Reserve Bank of India, and reportedly about half of the banknotes in circulation in India are printed there. So the final images are my father and his grandson, also called Eric, at the Air Force Museum in Dayton, and one of me by the nose wheel of the Collins Foundation B-24 in Dayton. I'm eternally grateful to the nose wheel, and more seriously to the 7th ERS that rescued my father. There's a very moving entry in a book by Mike Jones, which is based on interviews he conducted over several years with former airmen from Salbani at their annual reunions in Blackpool. It reads, "They gave their youth in order that future generations would be able to enjoy a liberty of mind. 141 souls from 355 and 356 Squadron gave their lives for that freedom." So, one final comment. Why were they called the Forgotten Air Force? The first priority of the British was to defeat Germany, and the US was primarily interested in keeping the Burma Road open in the north of the country to support the Chinese war effort. The troops and aircrews felt like they were always bottom of the list when it came to supplies of weapons, aircraft, and general support. At home, the population at large weren't truly interested in what was happening in Southeast Asia. It was the longest single campaign of the war, fought by the largest volunteer army, but it really was a forgotten campaign while it was underway, and today probably more so.